Good morning. Thanks for tuning in. It's Dan Kerr's DK Analytics. It is August 31st, Monday morning. I'm back in Bonita Springs from a Swiss stay. I'd like to chime back in with a video on U.S. politics in sharp relief, sort of, and U.S. monetary accommodation extended. Before I get into that, some brief valuation metrics based upon the last quotes that I saw. The US dollar, the Dixie stood at 92.3. The Fed's balance sheet closing back in on $7 trillion. The US 10-year yield last saw at 0.72%. That yield's coming up. The bond's been under a bit of pressure. The S&P 500 stood at a whopping 35.86. Oil at $42.97 per blue barrel. Gold per troy ounce at $1,974, and silver at $27.79. Some brief observations here. The buck is down a whopping 10.2% from its March 30th high 4 or 5 months back. The S&P has recently eclipsed its February all-time high by 4.1%. Oil keeps surprising to the upside. I think that has a lot to do with money printing. And precious metals look to be increasingly firmly in a dollar gold bull market, with silver up 45% since the last day in December of 2019. I mentioned politics, and I mentioned the fact that everything is in sharp relief. Let me drill down on that a bit by starting with the most obvious, the Democratic convention of a few weeks ago, where they displayed their 2020 platform. I'm going to provide a link in the comments section of the video to this. You can have a look for yourself. Their platform, filled with over 80 pages of central planning over freedom, the Democrats, dictates to correct generational wrongs instead of taking personal responsibility for one's own life. Abortion over life, select lives matter more than all lives matter. Demagoguery, intimidation, and masks over science in our virus situation. More redistributionism and regulation over a property rights revival. Green cronyism over affordable energy. Open borders and encompassing welfare for every immigrant at American taxpayers' expense. More balkanization instead of Americanization, a public school monopoly over school choice, what divides us over what unites us, and how an increasingly expansive and intrusive government can fix it all. Welcome to the Democratic platform, which frankly reads like the Communist Manifesto, not like America's founding documents, which greatly limited and enumerated the power of government while securing personal liberty and inalienable rights, and also demanding personal responsibility, civil behavior, and a virtuous people in return. The Trump Republicans, in contrast, broadly stood for the founding principles of this nation at this year's RNC, Republican National Convention, just ended late last week. The fact that the Republicans chose not to present a Republican platform or manifesto is at least partly indicative of the fact that Republicans have a much greater aggregate constitutional embrace. In other words, the federal government's role should primarily be to create an optimal playing field in which enterprise and freedom can flourish as personal responsibility for one's own actions is assumed. Contrast this with dictating how people should lead their lives, which the increasingly out-of-the-closet Marxist Democrats are all about. I'm referring to democratic planks such as determining and enforcing politically correct language, such as determining what can be said instead of standing for free speech, in terms of items such as promising sustained or planks, such as promising sustained coronavirus policy shutdowns, lockdowns, and mask-wearing diktats, even as the U.S. Virus death rate, which stood at 3,998 the week ended August 15th, that death rate plummeted to 23% of the April 18, 2020 high water mark and thankfully comprised only 7% of the average weekly national death toll of 54,000 people in the United States. Here is what 80-year-old George Gilder said about the mask aspect of our, what he calls, COVIDocracy. He said it in a recent piece after he flew with Alaskan Airlines, which, his tale to come, I can confirm as a realistic and sobering experience after having flown KLM and Delta from Switzerland to Amsterdam, to Atlanta, onto RSW or Fort Myers, Florida, 9 short days ago. Here's what Gilder wrote. Alaska Airlines upholds the prevailing evasiveness that wearing face coverings significantly reduces transmission of the COVID-19 virus. To a virus thousands of times smaller than the mesh of a mask, a cloth appears like an immense lattice of large and completely open windows and doors. The mask's chief effects, he continues, are to make politicians and pettifogs feel important and citizens feel humiliated. The cloth confines larger bacteria, aerosols, and mucus near receptive surfaces such as your eyes, nose, and mouth, and thus cultivates both mental and physical disease. He continued, a scrupulous study by Swiss researchers poured through dozens of peer-reviewed analyses on the impact of masks and found no significant benefits and several downsides. Oh well, such evidence is no longer relevant in an America where the egregious overreach of politicians is reducing constituents to a faceless mass of fearless and fractious non-entities. A nation without faces cannot be free or civilized. With one of the major presidential tickets joining in demanding a mandatory mask rule through election day and beyond, this election, he finished, has become a test of the face of a nation. The Republicans comprise the maskless party. They are also the party of law and order, while the Democrats have become the party of mainstream, crushing, perpetual lockdowns, anarchy, rioting, small business destruction, police being defunded, codified racism, and fabricated divisiveness. Speaking of fabricated divisiveness, perhaps the most sinister aspect of how the Democrats want to lecture, threaten, and intimidate society was on display in New Mexico last week thanks to a disgruntled employee. It is no mystery that the deeply entrenched administrative state, run by tenured, mainly Democratic bureaucrats, has been working, again behind the scenes, hand in hand with big cap companies and big government. As you might know, I call the whole nightmare increasingly broad daylight fascism, in which Standard & Poor's 500 kinds of companies, bailed out by taxpayers, pay homage to BLM violence, destruction, and anarchy. It's unbelievable, but it's true. By the way, I got the New Mexico heads up thanks to a lady by the name of Debbie, who is a subscriber to my YouTube channel and may be posting some articles on my DK Analytics site in the not too distant future. Specifically, Debbie kindly drew to my attention a Zero Hedge article titled Sandia Labs Goes Nuclear on Employees Who Sparked Internal Revolt Over Critical Race Theory. It might be Sandy Labs. I'm not entirely sure. Forgive me for the mispronunciation. I'm going to provide you with the links to this whole disaster in the comment section of the video. Here's the nub of it. Fasten your seatbelts, especially white American males in managerial roles, because you're first. We know that this is the beginning of what they're up to. I'll get to that in a second. And if it happens to white males in high positions, it's going to go on from there, right? You're the first domino. What am I referring to? This is from last week. Here we go. A major nuclear laboratory forced white male executives to undergo white privilege training that amounted to racism masquerading as anti-racism. City Journal contributing editor Chris Rufo told Tucker Carlson tonight, last Thursday. This was a mandatory program for white males, Rufo said, where they were supposed to essentially break down their white male identity, confess their sins to diversity trainers, and at the end of their session, get this, they actually had to, the white executives, they actually had to write letters of apology to women and people of color based on what they learned about their privilege. Speaking of privilege, allow me a point of personal privilege before continuing. My second to last post, which I placed on the site on August 16th, titled AG Barr to the Rule of Law Rescue, was picked up by Zero Hedge on the following day, August 17th, and retitled Gold, in case AG Barr's Rule of Law Rescue Plan fails. Back to politics, or two parties in sharp relief, or highly divided. Yet, in one sense, they are highly united, not highly divided, which is the second big picture topic of this video related to monetary accommodation. Both parties, led by Biden, if Biden can lead anything, and Trump, are way out over their skis in terms of wanting to run a totally outsized federal government generating trillion-dollar annual deficits with over 2 million unelected, unaccountable, typically tenured federal bureaucrats issuing the vast majority of new laws called regulations. They're doing this in place of the legislative branch, Congress, right? Neither printing money nor de facto legislation by bureaucrats, again also known as regulations, are constitutional. Neither printing money or unrepresentative bureaucratic-based de facto laws are constitutional, much less good economic sense for the general public. Regulatory compliance, and I've been over this, but let me briefly touch on it to give you flavor. Regulatory compliance costs for just manufacturing companies in the United States amounts to nearly 10% of US GDP. And US or American corporate litigation costs are nearly 3 times as high as Europe's as a percent of GDP. In short, the policy dystopia of nearly intractable regulatory and litigation headwinds, coupled with a highly dysfunctional, globally uncompetitive public school monopoly, are the flies in the ointment that are largely to blame for America's chronic, gaping trade and budget deficits. I'll leave corporate America out of it for now. In any event, Trump and the Republicans want to have a go at 2 of the 3, namely regulation, regulatory reform, and school choice, while the much more statist Democrats want to effectively add insult to injury on all 3 fronts, all right? Regulatory, litigation, lacking school choice, and they, the Democrats, comprise the bureaucracy that runs the government. And the Democrats are also in bed with all-powerful trial lawyers and teachers' unions. So they're all moving in the same direction. Absolute tyranny. The unsustainable finances of America as a whole, as well as much of the West, have obviously been building for quite a while, but they are accelerating. And I like to call the free market capitalism destructive, toxic public policy stew a child or the prodigy of central bank monetary policy. In plain English, thanks to money printing and negative or zero interest rate policies. That policy is also known as increasingly pronounced currency debasement, which the US Constitution and prior gold and silver standards around the world sought to avoid, given the disastrous results of unbacked money, and that has even been noted by Keynes as being inevitable. Here in America, on both sides of the aisle, all politicians, including, by the way, politicians around the world, are stout defenders of counterfeit currency expansion because they can promise voters and big cap companies more than tax receipts. That is, they can promise them benefits that exceed and subsidies and bailouts that exceed the tax receipts the government collects. In other words, a free lunch, if you will, that will finance redistributionism and cronyism and get them reelected. In reality, printing money is not only unconstitutional, dear rhinos and coronacrats, it discourages savings with zero and negative interest rate policies, generates economic weakness over strength, and fuels inflation while it places takers over makers, debtors over creditors, and Wall Street and K Street over Main Street. Some capital formation program, not some job formation program or some jobs furthering program, not. And therein lies the fatal flaw. Our counterfeit currencies, which politicians hope voters won't cotton onto, that this can be sustained. Sadly, politicians are right because the inflation central banks cause is a sneaky thief. You don't know who's robbing you until it suddenly isn't. And then it is too late for the economy and for society. The rule of the jungle or anarchy soon beckon. A faltering currency brings us Venezuela and Zimbabwe time and time again, as history richly attests. In fact, the Fed's new monetary policy, announced by Fed Chief Powell recently, pledges to address full employment shortfalls. Fed policy creates unemployment. But it promises to address full employment shortfalls while also aiming for above 2% inflation via sustained 0% interest rates that it controls, the short end, and via money printing at the longer and junk end of the curve. The sustained yield deprivation will continue to starve the economy of savings. Why save if you get nothing for it? While it continues to encourage unproductive investment. Think of zombie companies rising to 19% of total company universe in the US from 3% only 15 years ago. Clearly, the Fed is aiming for nominal output growth over real output growth. The price? Sustained subpar GDP expansion. We've seen it now for more than a decade. And what we're also going to see is it's going to start featuring rising consumer goods and services inflation. By the way, rising inflation also happens to be the cheapest way for debtors to repay creditors. There we go again with that sneaky thief. Not exactly bond and stock valuation positive developments. It's also known as stagflation. And as said, don't think for a second that the other leading central banks won't continue to ape the capital, price discovery, and real investment incentive destroying Fed. That is, if they haven't already preempted it here. Once again, this huge asset valuation implication, that is, once goods and services inflation begins to increasingly reflect monetary base bloat being transferred to the money supply, thanks to consumers and treasurers raising their inflation expectations, which the devastating fallout from the global coronavirus shutdowns and lockdowns will exacerbate via a stout supply contraction starting with small business and extending to global supply chains. This is already happening and it will continue, especially in the small business sphere. More on that in a second. In short, print a lot of money, shrink supply. What do you get? How about stagflation, especially in vital goods and services for the majority of people? Yet, if you look at the 4-decade-old global bond bubble, you'd think we'd have nothing but price stability and blue skies ahead of us. And this would be prior to pricing in incomparably large global solvency risks as reflected by global debt having ballooned to 331% of global GDP by early April, from 282% of global GDP in 2008 prior to the financial crisis. In case the numbers are confusing, let me put it differently. The growing debt to GDP, the growing global debt to global GDP, constitutes an $87 trillion increase in global debt, which is the rough equivalent of 1 year's worth of global GDP. And this 87 trillion was chalked up in only about 12 years. And at 33%, at 331% of GDP, global GDP, that is global debt, or over 255 trillion in global debt. That number was prior to the coronavirus policy response debacle, during which we've seen, it's an April number, that 255 trillion in global debt, the global response to the coronavirus, this debacle, has seen debt the world over exploding by trillions of dollars on a monthly basis. So we're set to massively accelerate our debt in absolute and relative to GDP numbers. In addition, in the US, I'm talking about things that are going to provide massive headwind to economic growth, economic recovery, profit growth, productivity expansion, and so forth. In the US, to take another side of what ails the beast, 27 million people are still on unemployment rolls. That is 16.9% of the labor force, and that's possibly going to ramp back up in the near future. In addition, between 30 and 40 million Americans face eviction notices prior to this year's end. Meanwhile, in Europe, 45 million people have been furloughed in Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Spain, but the unemployment rate barely budged because furloughs don't count. And on both continents, small businesses where up to 50% of the private sector workforce toils, those businesses have been totaled, those small businesses have been totaled by nearly 6 months of coronavirus lockdown, shutdown insanity. Specifically, roughly half of all small businesses are expected to close their doors for good. If these aren't depressionary numbers, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, both money printing and debt keep soaring. They're tied at the hip, as you know, as does the liquidity-fueled stock market. How long until bubble bonds and stocks come under economic reality pressure from both solvency and earnings power perspectives, no matter who wins the election? That said, from sanity to sustaining what's left of our freedom in our Western culture, I obviously hope the Republicans eviscerate the Democrats in the upcoming election. In fact, I made 3 small bets this spring that Trump would win, possibly by a landslide. However, it is too late to save our fiat money-based financial system, regardless of who wins. Thus, the only question is, will we be given the chance to deal with our rapidly metastasizing bankruptcy with the rule of law / the Constitution still hanging by a thread, with a remote chance of redemption on the line, including the necessity of returning to constitutional money? Or will we go full tilt into rule of man despotism, which the current Marxist anarchy, cultural divisiveness, and the destruction that is the progeny of the Democratic Party and the Pravda Press. This is what they've been nurturing, namely anarchy, culture divisiveness, are 2 of the planks that set the table for iron-fisted government, top-down, martial law kind of stuff sustained. In other words, will the current lawlessness and mayhem spread from democratic cities to all of America? That is, until it is put down by iron-fisted rulers, promising to save us from ourselves. Remember, Obama sought after fundamental transformation. And when they do transform us and then save us from ourselves, while they have us at each other's throats, they will then determine every aspect of our lives. And what remains of freedom and tolerance will sunset for generations. I truly think that this is what is at stake in the upcoming election. And because we both know what is unavoidable economically and financially, regardless of which party wins in November, I strongly suggest you continue to review your investable wealth for bubble glow, and take the gifts that central planning-based valuation insanity is providing you to reallocate in the direction of assets that can't be printed and will prove vital in the choppy times ahead. And in so doing, don't forget to add some real money to your holdings in physical form in your possession. I hope you've gotten something out of my thoughts. Thanks a lot for listening. I'm going to say over and out for now. Bye-bye.